Next, French President Emmanuel Macron is gearing up to co-host the Africa Forward Summit with his Kenyan counterpart today. Trade and cross-border investment is set to top the agenda. It's the first time France is hosting a summit of this kind in an English-speaking African country. Analysts say the summit is part of a push by France to expand its influence in Africa after Sahel countries cut ties. Well, let's speak more on this. We're going to cross over to Paul Melly, who's a consulting fellow of the Africa programme at Chatham House. Paul, thank you so much for joining us on the programme. France has described this summit as an opportunity for a new partnership. Is this a case of geopolitical survival in Africa from France after being pushed out of Sahel countries?
I think on one level it certainly is. In the more recent years after the setbacks in West Africa, particularly with obviously the breakdown in relations with the Sahel countries, which forced the departure of French troops from the Sahel, and a sometimes rather delicate, difficult recalibration of the security partnerships with coastal West African states such as Senegal. Yes, certainly in this way, it's a chance, an attempt by France to sort of bounce back. But that's not the whole story, because in fact, from pretty early on in his presidency, Macron wanted to rebalance in geographical terms, if you like, France's engagement with the continent. He's always been a strong believer in the importance of Africa as a partner for the future because of the continent's strong population growth, its resilient economic growth, its huge potential, not just its mineral resources, but its potential in a much wider economic and even political sense when you're talking about international issues like climate change and Africa's voice on the world stage. So actually, it was right back in 2019 that he became the first ever French president to make an official presidential visit to Kenya, where the summit is now taking place. So this is really a bit of a continuation of a strategy that's run right through his presidency, but has had to become more important in the last several years after the setbacks in the Sahel.
Well, Macron has spoken about ending France-Afrique. How different are these new partnerships set to be to the old model that has been heavily criticised?
Well, they're very different, really, because France's relations with English-speaking countries, Nigeria, which is its biggest economic partner on the African continent, South Africa, Kenya, are based on a shared agenda of economic trade, high levels of trade, substantial investment, and, as I say, sometimes partnerships on sort of wider issues about peace and security across Africa, or at the global level, tackling climate change, that kind of thing. That's very different from the evolution of relations that has taken place painstakingly, decade over decade, between France and the countries that used to be colonies of France in the west and the center of the continent, and of course Madagascar and Comoros off in the Indian Ocean, which has been much more difficult because of all the intense political sensitivities around those relationships and periods when France has been sometimes rightly accused of interfering very heavily in their internal affairs, and which has made even tackling common problems like climate change or, of course, the upsurge of terrorism in the Sahel politically very difficult and sensitive on all sides. Whereas the partnership with countries that have not had that colonial relationship with France has always been easier, whether it's East Africa, as in Kenya with this summit, or West Africa, for example, with Nigeria. And this is the traditional summit that has often taken place between France and African countries. But this time, for the first time ever, it's taking place in an English-speaking African country, and that's a big signal.
And what do the African countries that are involved in this, what do they stand to gain? In the past, France and other Western nations have, their moves in Africa has been described as extractive. What real benefits will these African countries get from partnering with France?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. One is a reinforcement of this much more balanced relationship, whether it's economic or political, between African countries. And around 30 heads of state and government are expected at this summit, for example. And between them and France, which is, after all, a G7 economy, a major player in the EU. But the other thing is they have some shared agenda items, and not just the question of climate change, but also finance. France, and Macron in particular, has been pushing really hard for a rethinking of the international development finance system, a rethinking of resources, how to get more funds at a more affordable level made available to African countries in international terms, whether at the IMF, for example, or through development finance. And also, France has been one of the countries, alongside the UK, for example, that has been strongly in favour of a stronger African voice in the UN Security Council. So certainly Africa has things to gain from this reshaped relationship, and it's not just about a bilateral link to France. Actually, it's if you like, complementary to, for example, France EU summits that we've seen over the Africa EU summits that we've seen over recent years, and Africa's determination to diversify its relationships. So African countries don't feel that they should always be expected to have their priority relationship with the country that used to be the colonial power. So a country like Kenya or like South Africa or like Nigeria is looking much more widely internationally. They're looking to China, they're looking to the US. And so for English-speaking countries, building up relationships with France is part of that approach, just as for Francophone countries, say for Senegal or Cote d'Ivoire, Gabon, building relations with China, with the US, with the UK, with Russia even, are also part of that diversification. Africa doesn't want to be sort of pre-slotted into a strategy that's based on history, which, after all, we're now talking, it's almost 70 years ago, the era of independence. That's a very long time. Countries have been independent, in many cases, more or less as long as they were ever colonies, and they don't want to be trapped in some sort of old historical map of connections and influence. And so, in a curious way, that's what this summit is about, by moving the relationship between African countries and one particular outside player into a different forum, a different focus, in this case with a big focus on economic partnership, technological relationships. That's part of that sort of moving away from old history, if you like.
Paul, great to get your thoughts on this. Thank you so much for joining us on the programme. Paul Melly there,
It's a pleasure.
who is a fellow at Chatham House, just joined us.